Hi folks, Jason here. In this video we're going to be drawing in perspective and essentially covering 1-point, 2-point and 3-point perspective. We'll be using some really simple geometric shapes like squares and then turning those into cubes, for example. Once we've got that foundation, we'll explore how we could apply it to other things, maybe a prop or a little asset or even an interior space like a room. Then I'll show you how that connects to the kind of things you might be doing in games art or animation or any other field. So, for example, creating concept art or doing environments or even backgrounds for your own projects. We'll also touch on a few basic ideas about lighting and shading, nothing heavy or overly technical, just enough to help you visualize form and direction of light. So yeah, it's all about giving you some of the tools that can help to build on your own projects, and hopefully we'll be able to see some really good results at the end of it. So without further ado, let's get into it. So in order to create perspective, I'm going to start off by creating what's called a horizon line. So I'm going to take the opacity down on here. And of course, you can follow this by drawing in your sketchbook. And I'm going to do a horizon line, something like this, right? So this is what's called the horizon line. And then anywhere on this line, you can create what's called a vanishing point. And it's usually indicated by like an X. So for example, I could sort of make a little X here, like so. Now, depending on where you want to put your object, it'll sort of determine what kind of perspective you get. So let's do a few versions. So I'm going to do one where it's literally in between the line. So I'm going to draw a square, like so, right? And then what I'm going to draw is what's called receding lines. So these are lines that kind of go from the vanishing point on the horizon line to the corners of your object. So I'll illustrate. I'm going to select this, and basically I'm just going to draw a line in between that corner and the vanishing point. And then I'm going to do the same on the other corner. So now you can see we're actually creating perspective. If we all wanted to create a cube, of course, we're going to have to determine at what point does this, do we end it? So you can make a judgment on this and say, okay, I want it to end, say something like that. And then you can basically draw a line going down there. And then to sort of firm it up, so once you've kind of sketched it in, then you can sort of perhaps even, I'm doing this using a Wacom tablet, but I'm just going to now firm this up with my Wacom pen and just create more definite lines. So that'll be drawing it on the line. Now, going back, what about if we dropped it below? So I'm going to draw another horizon line and another vanishing point, same before. In fact, what I might do is I might just sort of copy that one as well, because we'll do another version. So I'll go copy that, and I'll just drop that below, say there. Okay. And going back to it, let's say I've got my horizon line there. So I'm going to this time put the square beneath the horizon line. Let's see what happens. So again, just like before, I'm going to draw a square. In fact, let's put it in line with the other one, like so. Now look what happens. We've now got 3 points instead of 2 points, right? So now, in fact, even if I perhaps even dropped it, let's go and drop this whole thing a little bit further down to say there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw these lines, these receding lines, going to the corners. And look what happens. I'm now getting the top of the cube, right? And then in order to kind of like make it a cube, I can just again just sort of do a line going down vertically and then have one kind of going across like so. And then to firm it up, I'm going to just draw in or firm up those edges like so. And now you have a cube, but a cube that's going in a more kind of aerial view. All right, let's move on now to, let's try from above. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this, actually, because I'm running out of space, I'm going to put this to say over here. And this time around, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the square above. I'll just take the strength of that brush down. And let's draw something, say there. So now if I take it down to the vanishing point, you'll see now it's a little bit like the previous one there, except now we're seeing it from underneath. So this would essentially be it's not quite a bird's eye view, but it's getting there. So this would be more like the bird's eye view, and this would be more like the worm's eye view. So again, just like before, I'm going to draw those lines going across, and then I'm just going to increase the strength of that. Obviously, if you're using a pencil, you just sort of press down a little bit harder, or even use, a more, like a sort of, if you're using a HB, you might use like something like a sort of 2B or 3B. All right, so now we have the cube, but this time we're looking at it from underneath. So these are really important things to understand about when you're doing perspective, because the horizon line, and particularly the vanishing point, can determine whereabouts in space your shape resides. Okay. Now, beyond this, what you could do before we go on to 2-point perspective is you can add things like shading. So, for example, if I were to, let's say the light source is coming from this direction, let's say that's the sun, then if that's the light's hitting here, then this will not be too well lit, right? Depending on, like, if it's like, say, I don't know, if it's quite an acute kind of light, or if it's during the day, it might be different, but chances are if there's a direct light on there, then this is going to be more lit up, and this area here is going to be more in shade. Furthermore, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a bit of a shadow. Now, drawing shadows, certainly at this angle, can be a bit tricky because there's no real definite kind of edge to it, but you can at least just kind of give a suggestion of a shadow there, because depending on where it is, so for example, if this were the sun and this were traveling, say, through the sky, going in this kind of direction, the shadow, just like a sundial, it would change. So as that light kind of goes further across, the shadow would actually start to do this, right? It would start to, you would actually get it in perspective as well. But you probably have something like this going on. And then as it progressed, you'd probably come over this way, for example. Just good to kind of experiment and also look in real life, look outside on particularly on a sunny day, and just see how shadows form on objects. A lot of this is just observation. All right. So the similar thing with the other cubes, for example. Again, if the light were coming down on this one, same direction. Yes, that would be in shadow. And these two would probably be sort of even. It could even be, you could even sort of make the case that maybe this one is a little bit more in shade. Certainly if it was hitting more like the top directly, like there, then there's a good chance that this area here might have a little bit of, might be in a bit of shade, not a lot, but enough to kind of like distinguish it, say, from this side here, but not from the top. And just like before, you get, certainly if it was more like above, you might even get like a longer shadow. It just really depends on where the light source is. We've all seen like long shadows on like on a sort of like a sunny day where it's getting like late afternoon, right? And you get these like long shadows that form like that. Now with this, it would follow the same route, except would you get any shadows? Well, what you might see is that part will be like lit. This part might be partly in shadow. This will be in shadow, like so. Now, because this is so far off the ground, you may not even get a shadow. But let's say, for example, there was a bit of floor. Let's say we had some flooring, something like that, right? You may actually get some shadow. It may be that you get not a definite shadow, you might just get like the suggestion, a hint of a bit of shadow above that's been sort of cast down there like that. It just really depends on whereabouts the light source is. So hopefully that's we've explored and explained a 1-point perspective. Now we're going to come on to 2-point perspective. So for this, I'm just going to create another layer. So I'm going to just go and create another layer. We'll call this drawing layer 2, sorry. Drawing layer 2. Drawing layer. And we're going to do some 2-point perspective. So I'm going to take the opacity down. And so this time, again, I'm going to do an horizon line like so. Okay. And we'll continue using the cube. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a point there, but this time round, I'm going to do a vanishing point there. So now we've got them at 2 sides. So then what we can do is we can place, instead of like doing like a square, what we can do is we can just do a single line like so. And then what we'll do is we'll decide whereabouts we want it to end. And then from there, we can do the receding lines again. Like so. And then one to there as well. And then do the same on the other side. All going to that vanishing point. And then to actually make the cube, we can decide, okay, it's going to be around about there for there. And we'll have one there as well. And again, like before, we can put a bit of shading there. We can actually firm it up a little bit. And then make those lines a bit more defined. We'll just draw that in by hand. Okay, and I'm just going to sort of use the smudge tool and kind of blend that. And obviously, like with the shadow, again, quite difficult to do, but if we do have something like a light source coming in there, we may have something like, say that it may even have like, shadow in perspective, so it's kind of hitting, it's coming kind of from that direction. So again, just kind of blend that out. But again, a lot of this is just observation and also just experimenting and just seeing what works. So that's 2-point perspective from that angle. Now, here's an interesting thing. What if we then, if I can just take my layer, let's move that to say there. What if we move that line now below the horizon line? So let's just take the opacity down on there. And I'm going to probably come over here. And again, I'm going to draw the horizon line. And I'm going to do that there. But this time, I'm going to drop the line below that line, like so. and then kind of go, okay, right, that's where it's going to end. So look what happens now. I'm going to connect these up like before. Again, if you're doing this with a pencil, you can just obviously use a ruler for this. So it's going to join these two together like so from each vanishing point. And then I'm going to determine where I'm going to end it. So I'm going to put, say, the end, say something like that. Same on the other side, like so. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to connect these 2 points up to the opposite. So I'm going to connect this pot up here to that vanishing point there. And then this point here to that vanishing point. And then if you look, if I just increase the opacity of that, now we've got this kind of 2-point perspective cube. That's looking, a lot more kind of solid, right? And then again, just like before, what we can do is we can just sort of shade that side in like so. And, you could use like rubber or use your finger and just blend that in a little bit. And, if we want to kind of create a shadow, we can sort of create a bit of a shadow. Again, we're going to see a bit more. So this will be a bit more like top down almost, not quite top down, but certainly from an angle. Okay. And again, just like before, what we can also do is we can do it from above, right? So I'm going to move this over to the side. So let's just go and move that over to say there, something like that. And now let's have a look at doing it from above. So again, I'm just going to take the opacity down on that, and I'm going to do the horizon line, say there, with the vanishing points like so. But this time I'm going to put the line here, right? And we'll have it as, say, something like that. Now, this is probably going to be quite acute. This will give it sort of quite, I guess it could be like a sort of wide angle kind of view of it. So you might want to, extend it a little bit more, perhaps either way. So it could maybe even to what I'll do, I'll just move that over to somewhere in the middle. And let's see what it looks like when we connect these up now, like so. So we've got that one there. So that to there. And then that one to there as well. Excuse me. And then we'll draw some lines down. And this will be forming our cube. And then just like before, we'll have that going to that one there, to that vanishing point. We'll have that corner going to that vanishing point. And now if we just increase the opacity, and I'll just draw this in by hand, we've now got a cube in 2-point perspective, and this is going more into the worm's eye view. And again, using like a bit of shading, you probably wouldn't see much shading here, I guess, if you were kind of looking at it from the ground, because you're on the ground pretty much. So it's not going to be, you're not really going to have a shadow as such. I mean, there might be, depending if you're stood a fair way away. It's conceivable, depending on the light is, that there could be like a bit of a sort of a suggestion of a sort of a shadow, perhaps. It could even be, something like that. But again, it just takes a bit of a sort of experimentation. It just really depends where that is. And again, like the I was saying earlier, you kind of have to kind of like think, well, okay, if the light source is kind of hitting it there, or even if it was like, say, hitting it from the top, there's probably actually a good chance that this would be in a bit of shade. That might even be a bit stronger at the side, like so. And maybe even a bit on there. So maybe as a good part of this cube would be shaded, and the bit that would be the lightest would actually be at the very top. So anyway, so hopefully that's explained 2-point perspective. And in this next part, we're going to be looking at 3-point perspective. Okay, so in 3-point perspective, we're going to be taking the same approach. We're probably going to make something more like sort of elongated for the cube. So it looks a bit more like a building this time. So what I'm going to do is make sure that that's all the opacity is there. I'm going to make the horizon line quite high up. So say around about there. I'm going to put the vanishing point, probably put one there, and I'll put one there. But this time around, I'm going to have a vanishing point. If I just draw down the middle there, I'm going to have a vanishing point right at the very bottom. And what I'm going to do, like before, I'm going to make a line or define this line a little bit more to say something like that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our cue from the vanishing points again. So I'm going to click on there and there, and there and there. And the same thing again with the other vanishing point. So we kind of make this like V shape. But this time round, instead of us just going straight down the side, we're going to use this vanishing point here. And I'm going to project out. Now I'm going to make a little mark there, a little mark there, just so I've got something to kind of hit. And I'm going to make my projections something like that this time. I'm just sighting this by eye, but something like that. So now we've got the sides, and then from these corners, like so, I'm then going to take that one back to there, to that vanishing point, and this one back to there, to that vanishing point. And then just to sort of define it a little bit more, I'm just going to take that opacity back up. It's going to go and zoom in a little bit. And I'll just fill that line in a bit more, just so it's a bit more defined. But you can see there now, we've got, it's kind of like an elongated cube. So we're kind of almost like a sort of building. So I'll just define that a little bit more and just do that. And you can see it's very different. So now what we're getting is a kind of like a very exaggerated sort of bird's eye view, as opposed to, if we go back to the previous one with the 2-point perspective, it's even like from high up, it's still like relatively like low down. But with this, it's a lot more exaggerated. So it's like, it's got more of a kind of skyscraper quality about it. So what we can do from here is, once we've kind of created this shape, we can actually have a play around and create more of a grid and see what we can do. So in order to do that, I'm going to just take the opacity down a little bit, and I'm going to create more receding lines. Sorry, go back to my brush, beg pardon, and go to create some receding lines. So something like that. So we're going out from that vanishing point. And you could already see like one there, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to work my way around like so. And one over there, all the way over to there. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. I'm going to create these. Now, obviously, if you're doing this just with a pen and pencil, or pencil and paper and a ruler, obviously you want to be just getting it as close as you can, and then drawing out from those vanishing points. Okay, so we've got something like that going on. But what it does is it gives us a guide. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take the opacity down on that a little bit to say there. I think I'll just create another layer on top of that. I'll call that, I'll call this also drawing layer 3. And I'm just going to draw over the top. So I've got like a slightly darker, yeah, I think that's kind of looking all right. That's probably about right. And then I'm going to just define this shape a little bit more. And then bring that down like so. And even to there. Okay. And just down the middle. I'll just bring that all the way down the middle like so. And then you can start to create other parts. So you could even like experiment a little bit and kind of go, okay, well, maybe I'll have another shape here, right? On this grid. Okay. And again, because I know where the vanishing point is, I'm going to take that. Let me just take the opacity down. I'm going to take that all the way to there. So on those corners, like so. And even on that corner as well. It is very faint. Let me just take it up just a little bit. Say something like that. Something like that. Like that. And then on that corner, like so. And then I could take it from there. So I could make the bottom of the building something like that. Then all of a sudden, you've kind of got, there we go. You've got the bottom of that building there. And we've got the edge, which is there. And that's going down to the bottom like so. And just play around, maybe create some other shapes. So maybe like one there. See what this brings. Right, so I'm just going to draw this freehand because I've got the guides already. And then I'm from these corners, I'm going to, let's try that again. I'm going to try and put those points to there, say. And then the perspective along there. Oh, I've already got that there. So we could even, or maybe there even. So what I could do is from there to there, say. So then I've got the bottom of that shape, like so. And then you could sort of keep going with it. You could sort of have one, maybe even have one higher. So you could even flip it where you've kind of got the receding lines going above, right? I mean, we're kind of running out of space here a little bit, but you could even have, say, something like that going on. And then you could do like, have, let's just try and take that across, say there, one over there, then one over, say, here. And we could have that one. So we could have one at the top here. And that again is coming down to that vanishing point, to say something like that. And maybe I have like another point there. Something like that. And then again for the edge of it, it could be something like that. And then I can get the exact perspective, say going from there. And again, I'm just going to draw this freehand. It's just easier to do it that way. So you can end up with all these kind of like shapes that, again, it's like structural, but again, it could be used for anything where you're just kind of thinking, okay, well, I could do that, maybe make some other ones here. And there might be part of you kind of thinks, hold on a minute, it kind of looks a bit wrong. Surely it doesn't, but it's like you're working from perspective. So it's going to be right, more or less, it's going to be right what you're doing because you're working from the perspective lines that this is dictating, right? So I could take that to there, like so. So if I could like maybe try and like isolate some of this now, or at least clean it up, so I can maybe take away, where are we? Up the opacity on that. Oops, and take away some of these lines, like so. Do that one there, do these. Just so we can get a bit of clarity, that's all. Take that away. We could actually just isolate that now, just so we can actually see a bit clearer. We can see here now we've kind of got these random shapes, but they're all from the perspective, right? So it's certainly a lot more reliable than trying to sort of sight it by eye and actually do it this way. And, you know, particularly anything like, you know, whether it's just like a regular environment that you're doing, or it could be a sci-fi environment that you're doing, you know, we can have a go at, let's say, again, like the light's kind of coming from this direction. We could have a go at, where are we? Have a go at just playing around with some of the shading here, for example, like so. We'll have some like there, say. And again, I might just strengthen that a little bit. Something like that. And do a bit on the on this here. It just kind of helps to just sort of define it a little bit more, give it a bit more solidity. So a bit on there, say. And of course, that's going to be kind of shaded. So we'd have that in shading. And again, depending on like how far you want to take it, there's a good chance, because this has been kind of blocked by that one, and most of this is going to be in shading. You know, if these were real objects, you know. So it's also a good exercise again, and I mentioned this at the beginning, about trying to understand lighting and like objects that you have in the environment, and how, you know, how they might look. You know, this might be a bit in shading as well, and maybe a bit on the side. But it's always good to kind of observe from life as well. So, you know, don't just kind of try and make it up. Have a look at other objects in the world and drawing things from life as well. So whether it's just drawing like a box or a cup or things like that. So that wraps it up for this part of the video. I think in the next part of the video, we're going to have a look at, we're going to choose something, so you can find an image that's in 2D, and we'll see if we can apply this principle to that and create some perspective. So that will be in the next part of the video, folks. Before we do that, though, folks, I just wanted to just kind of go over trying some different shapes, because we're going to be attempting to recreate some props in perspective mode, and it will require some slightly different shapes. So what do I mean? So if I go now back into my brush mode, we've already covered doing like, say, a square, like so. You know, something like that. And then from there, we've managed to kind of create a sort of cube in perspective, something like that, which is great. However, there are other shapes to consider. So, for example, like a circle. So, how do you turn a circle into a sphere? Well, you can do that with a variety of ways. You can do sort of shading and things like that. You can also do like ellipses, like so, to try and get a sense of that kind of 3D shape. But doing things like, for example, like what we're doing here with the shading, just to illustrate, I could sort of shade there, and then I could sort of just shade this bit around the edge here, and just kind of create this shaded effect there. Maybe even use the eraser there just to do that. And you could do other things. I'll circle back to this in a minute, but you can do other things you can do to kind of make it look a little bit more 3D. To kind of it's giving it that kind of it's perspective, but also that kind of 3D quality. And then there are other shapes like, of course, we've done that. We've done that. Things like, say, a triangle, right? So what would be a triangle? A triangle would probably go more into a cone, right? So again, you probably do something like an ellipse. And again, just like the other two, you probably do put a bit of shading in there and do something like that. But that could also be a pyramid, so as well as like being a triangle. So that's kind of halfway between a triangle and a sort of cube, right? So you could have something like, say, it's more like a sort of prism, isn't it, than a pyramid, but say something like that. And again, you'd probably like to shade that a little bit in there. And I think this is really good to kind of practice if you're not that sort of familiar with it, because all of these things, all the geometric shapes feed into making basically most objects, when you're sort of drawing them. So definitely so the primary ones are squares, and you've also got circles and you've got triangles. And of course there are other shapes, but these are the kind of primary ones. And you might want to just experiment before we go into this next part of the video. Is just experiment with trying that. As I said earlier, there are other things you can do to kind of make these look a little bit more kind of three-dimensional. So, for example, I could sort of darken these, work into them a little bit more. And you can also do things like we could add like a lighter color, right? So I'll just blend that there. So I could maybe even change that from from white to black. And then from there, what we could do is then add like a sort of highlight. I might just turn the opacity up a little bit. So end up with something like that. So you got a bit more of a kind of highlight. These are all good things to kind of to get into. Forget like drawing, or trying to paint per se. Just try like black and white. You'll learn a lot more about values and how light works if you do that. If you go straight in with color, it can really complicate matters. So I'll do the same thing with this cone here. Just add a little highlight, say there, as you can see. And then you can add, depending on like how reflective it is, but you can add some like highlights around the, again, if you're doing this traditionally, you're probably best off with like colored pencils. You can do, use crayons, things like that. Oh yeah, we missed out our cube, didn't we? So I'm just going to put a bit on there. Just go and zoom in a little bit, just so I can get a better view. And a bit around there, and even just kind of on the edge, something like that. And then also on this pyramid as well, you could add a little bit there. And then we'll just kind of blend that in. So these are just really good practices to kind of have if you're trying to kind of get to grips with shapes, just understanding like what you're dealing with really, and how to kind of create perspective. From there, obviously, like as said before, you could add a bit of shadow. So add a bit of shadow to some of these here, bit of shadow to that, and also a bit to that as well. Let's just blend those in. So again, just kind of quick, like little thumbnail sketches that you can do to kind of get into the mood. It's probably a better way of doing it. It's practicing your skills, but also it's kind of getting into that kind of like frame of mind of doing props. So definitely have a go at doing some of these, experiment. You could even, just to kind of wrap up this part of the video, but you could even do something like this and try and do something a bit more complex. So I could copy that. Let's just bring that, expand that out a little bit. So you could even do something like try and what should we do? You could even do something like so if this is like circular, so you'd have these like lines, these like what is it? Like ellipses, and you could think about, all right, what if I kind of cut into this? If this is an actual object, what would it look like if I say cut into it like so? and did something like that. Because then also you've got something else interesting going on. You've got like you've cut into that shape. You've also got some shading and stuff going on in here. We could even just erase some of this as well, just so to kind of to help illustrate what I'm doing. Say something like that, and blend some of that in. Take some of that out. Just clean this up a little bit. You know, you could even add some highlighting to it as well. Let's go back to our white. You know, and add, say, a highlight there, maybe a highlight there, something like that, and then kind of blend it. You know, and it's just interesting to kind of play around with. You know, you're starting to get a sense of like, it's really making that jump between like doing something that looks flat when you're drawing it and actually doing something that looks more 3D. Sure enough, you can do it in 3D in Blender or whatever, but this will give you a really good grounding in terms of like, you know, doing designs on, you know, whether it's just on paper or in Photoshop. Just something to bear in mind going forward. But anyway, that wraps up that part of the video. In the next part, we're going to be having a look at doing a couple of props in perspective. Okay, so now we're going to have a go at trying to attempt to turn both of these assets into sort of perspective drawings. Now, obviously, we're not going to go into like too much detail with it, maybe some of the details, but you can see there are like relatively complex shapes. If I just go and zoom in now, and let's go and have a look. We've got a lot going on there. We've got curves, of course. We've got some straight lines, and we've got some other kind of subtle shapes there. And then we've got this hammer shape, which we've got this kind of cylinder, and we've got this kind of hammer shape. But the best thing to do whenever you're approaching anything like this is to break it down into its components. So, for example, with this, if I go and do like a loose, you know, a loose, fairly loose drawing of it, what we've got really going on is this. We've got a box shape. Now, granted, we've got this kind of curve, but the curve in and of itself is going something like this. And this is going to look different in perspective, of course. And then we've kind of got this handle on top, right? So we've got something like that going. And again, this handle's got curves, right? It's got like a curve on it, curve there, and it kind of goes down. And this has got like, there's a little bit more going on here, you know, with the actual like metal sort of the sort of paneling that's kind of going on, and there's some other little bits and bobs, there's more decorative parts of it. But essentially, you're dealing with a block, but it's just kind of quite elaborate in terms of like some of the designs. Our job as designers is to kind of try and break this down into its kind of components, and just so it's not so intimidating anymore. You can kind of go, oh yeah, I understand like what's going on there, and this is just decoration, and you know we've got these other bits here kind of going on at the top, and also this bit in the middle as well near the handle, these kind of curves. So you know it's not like super easy, but at the same time, once you actually break it all down, it's also not that hard. So this is what we're going to attempt to do first, and basically we've got something like a sort of box shape. So in order to do that, I'm just going to erase my lines now. And what I'm going to do first is we can do it like this. We need the overall shape of shape and size of this. So you could take this as a guide to say something like that. And obviously we've got this kind of we've got the perspective. So we'd need something like an horizon line. So I'm going to maybe just use that perhaps as an horizon line, have one horizon line there. And we'll do it as, say, 2-point perspective. Now, assuming that this is going to be the height of it, like so, I can sort of draw a line, say there, and then from there, I can take my perspective lines now down to there, like so, like that. And then do the same on the other side, right? Something like that, okay? So we've kind of got that perspective going on. And then it's really determining, like, okay, how wide is it going to be? Well, it's obviously not going to be as wide as that. The chances are it's going to be probably like half the size of that, maybe even like 2/3 the size. So you'll end up with something that's kind of like something like that kind of going on. If you can see that, maybe I'll just increase that a little bit. So, you have something like, if that was like an end view of it, it'd be something like that. So I'll just undo that. So I'm going to make a sort of guess and say it's going to be something like that. I mean, obviously it's going to be longer. So we've got that kind of going on there. So I'm going to say it's going to probably be something like that in perspective. So now we've kind of got the width and we've got the length, but we do have a bit of a tricky thing, is we've got this curve. So what I'm going to do here is, I'm assuming so that looks to be about 2/3 of the way up. So that's kind of like where, if I kind of split this into thirds, then it's safe to assume that that's where the lid is. And then the lid's going to go down like that as well. But it does have a curve. So what you can do is you can basically try and make an educated kind of like guess on it and think, well, okay, so that's the middle. And then what we can do is we can perhaps even divide it up even more. So we can even divide it up into, so it's into quarters. Let's just try that again. Try and just something like that. And then what we can do is we can kind of stagger it. We can sort of pick points to where we're going to put the curve. Now, obviously, this curve is going to be relatively steep. So the curve's probably not going to start until around about there. So what we can do is, excuse me, we can begin. So that's our midpoint there. Let me just zoom in a little bit just so I can see it. So our curve is probably going to start there. And we're going to bring it round to, say, around there. And then it goes along, and then the curve actually begins. So we got a descent. So remember, if I just, let me just take that to there, and I'll just put a line in from there to my vanishing point. So the end of the curve is going to come around about there. So you've got something. So you've got like a curve there, goes flat, and then on that last part, it kind of curves around like so. And again, you can tidy this up. It's just getting the information in there. And then obviously from there, if I just zoom out a little bit, we've kind of got that. We've got this top part. So this is kind of where it starts. So I might just do that curve there. And then again, just come round like so. So just basically like drawing on the top there because it reaches that peak. So basically that's where the end of that curve is with our box. And then this actually drops down. So this comes round. You can see there, that kind of comes round if we had that at the front. So this is the front there. And then what we've got going on here is from there, we've got this little strip. So this is where you're just going to have to kind of go, right, well, okay, there's 4 of those. So I'm going to have part of the strip there. The second one, I'm probably going to have something like that. Then we've got the third one. Again, these are like strips of metal. I'm going to put a curve in, say something like that. And then we've got this last curve in that you can see there to come into around about there. Then we've got this kind of metal strip. Oops. We've got this metal strip. Just undo that if I can. There we go. And that's going to be coming up to say something like that. Then we've got that midpoint, and I might just increase that strength of that a little bit. And even the brush size, I might just take that up a little bit as well. So we've got something like that. So we've got that strip there. And also we've got this more like pronounced bit going on at the side there. And then that's that kind of part of the lot. I don't want to get too lost in the details with the shape, but it's going to go something like that at the top. And then we've got the bottom. So I'm going to bring that down. So that's that part of the lid. Then we've got, in fact, I might just undo that a little bit. Let's try that again. Just take the opacity down. So this bottom part here, that's the perspective on there. We'll have that going down to that other vanishing point there. So that's the other part of the lip that we'll have going on. Just draw that by hand. So we've got something like that, this kind of hexagonal thing going on. I might just for clarity, I might just do something like that and put there's that little bit of the lock in there. And then these kind of follow down. So that's following down from these strips, like so. And then we've got this bit of this kind of like bit of the stand. So that will probably start, say, around about there. So I'm just going to create a perspective line on there. And so that's going to be a bit more pronounced. So I'm going to bring that out from there. So these is a bit of a tricky one because it's kind of like curved. And then there's a little bit of a sort of lip underneath, like so. And then we've got the other foot. So let me just create that there's another part of the box there. Oops, I'm going to bring down. And that's where that other part, to say something like there. And then that's going to go the other way as well. So a bit of a tricky shape to do. And then that basically that will follow the same suit. So you'll end up with that little bit there, and then you'll end up with this other part of the casket, as it were. And then basically you work your way along. I mean, again, just very basic shapes. We try not to make it too complicated. It's relatively complex, but we keep all the shapes as simple as we can kind of keep them. And then I'll bring that down to there. This part we don't know. We don't know what it looks like. And also, you know, we could assume that though, that part of the lid is going to go something like that. And of course, we've got the handle as well. So the handle, it goes somewhere in the middle there. We know it starts actually pretty much on that ridge there. And then it ends on that ridge like so. And then all we need to do is like take a perspective line to say something like that. And then we've just got a bit of a curve. So the curve kind of comes up to say something like that. So we know that's kind of working there. And I'm just going to fill in some of these other lines as well now. I'm going to assume that maybe even this line follows through. So it does actually go like that. So you've got these two kind of lips to say something like that. Once you've kind of done that, then what you can do is you can sort of then, you know, obviously start to work in more detail. You've got things like the lock in there, and, you know, we don't want to get sort of too lost in the weeds with this, but, you know, you can begin to kind of sketch this out you know, in a kind of sketch, at least at this stage in a sort of sketch form. And then you'd basically work into more detail. So you'd add a bit of shading. So I'm not going to necessarily draw over the top of that, but you could take, say, something like that, and like we did with our cube, you could sort of add a bit of shading on the other side, just to kind of give it a bit more of a kind of 3D quality. And then, just sort of work into it. But you'd be looking to really start, to refine the kind of details on this really before you start sort of doing any shading. But in terms of a basic sketch, that'd be a really good place to kind of like to at least start to try and get some ideas. Now, moving on, and this will be closing out with the video, is something like the hammer. Now, the hammers might be actually a little bit simpler, because essentially what we've got going on is, if I just move both of these to the side for the time being, let's move it up to the top. With the hammer, we've got so I'm going to do another perspective line. Or horizon line, should I say. And I'm going to add a vanishing point there, vanishing point there. So for the edge of the hammer, put something like, say, that. And then just like before, we can sort of go and create these receding lines. And then make a decision about where the hammers, so it's obviously it's going to be longer. So this would be that part there. So the hammer shape itself is relatively simple. However, we've got this sort of more pronounced area here, which is, it's kind of like, it's slightly wider than the base. So what I'd be tempted to do is sketch it in by hand like so. You can use the receding lines, but then for this part, that's going to be falling within those lines like that, because these other parts that we've got going on are wider than the actual middle. So we've got something like that kind of going on. Then, of course, we've got the middle part, which is, the stem. And again, just kind of judging that, that's probably more than likely going to be square. We may even miss the top part of it, because obviously, where we've got our hammer on the horizon line, we're not looking down at the top, are we? Or even from above. From the top or from below. And then for this last part, again, I might just take a through line through there. And we've got essentially a cylinder. So this cylinder is going to be, if I were to sort of draw, say, two lines going down like that, it is a cylinder. If I were to sort of draw these little ellipses like so, that's the basic shape. However, you can see, if I go and zoom in, there are many different kind of shapes going on there. It goes in, it comes out. We've got these kind of rings. So what we're going to do is, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. To go to my brush, is attempt to at least follow that line. So we've kind of got this kind of going in. So we've kind of got this part here. We've kind of got something like that kind of going on. And that comes around that kind of curve. But then it comes in. So it's falling in within those lines. And then we've kind of got this ring. Say something like that. And then we've got another part going there. It's basically a continuation of the handle. Now that comes all the way down. So that's actually coming part way down like so. And then we've got this other ring, which is somewhere like there, I think, more or less. Then we've got another ring. And then after that, it kind of spaces out. So it kind of fans out like so, curves out. Then we've kind of got another ring. And then it kind of tapers in. And then we've got another curve like so. And then we've kind of got this point like that. And because, we're doing this in perspective, the only perspective you're really going to get with this is because it's a cylinder, is just mainly in the shading. And this is where you'd need to kind of go, oh, okay, well, then and again, this is just in sketch form. We're not talking about high renders. We're just talking about getting things, sketching out ideas for props, whether it's like weapons or whether it's assets for a video game. And so I'm just going to bring that in there. And then for the handle, obviously it doesn't look very 3D, but what we can do is we can just kind of shade in one side like so. And then we can sort of blend it. So depending on whether you're using Procreate or using a pencil or something like that, you can kind of create that, kind of that 3D kind of look. And then just like the previous video, we can add some highlights as well. So depending on, what medium you're using, you can kind of add things like that in there. I'm not really, bothered about adding too many details per se with this, but just to kind of like, as much as anything else, just to kind of highlight really. And maybe add a bit there, perhaps. Not so much on the other side. Then we've got this. And again, I might just kind of add a bit there. A bit of a highlight. Something like that. And then for this, what you can do is you can kind of add some highlights here. And we've got that thing with like the rings going around there. And just kind of have a play around really. Just thinking like, also squint your eyes. When you're doing stuff like this, squint your eyes. It really helps you to kind of see some of the values of the tones that you're using as well. That can be really handy. So again, I'm just going to add a bit there. And then what I'll do is I'll just use this smudge tool just to blend some of these out, just so they're not so pronounced. And then a bit there as well. Something like that. And again, you could just kind of keep going with this, but that's pretty much it. I'm going to kind of wrap this video up now. I'm hoping you've enjoyed it and it's given you perhaps a fresh insight in how you can transform your ideas, put them into perspective, and start applying it to your project. So that's it, folks. So thanks for watching, and hope you find it useful, and I shall see you in the next video. Okay, take care. Bye for now.